contemporaries in a more than Spenglerian sense, Zizek and Alexander Dugin. More than Spenglerian, more than Spengler, Spengler being the one who took over and popularized the Hegelian thesis in the form that it had mutated into by the World War I period, namely the obviousness that the end of history had not come either in the empirical sense, which Hegel did not assert in the gross sense of the end of wars or the end of human misery, but neither in the theoretical sense that the right form of organizing human life or the right governmental order, Politeia, had been discovered in his monarchical Prussian state. So instead, Spengler gives us account of, on a biological metaphor, of different sort of the flowerings of civilizations, and then rottings and goings away of the same. I think this, and then he posits that there are contemporaries, so that the same feature. So, for instance, he claims that empirically the beginnings of the principle of Freiheit or freedom are to be found amongst tribal peoples, especially in Africa, which he had fairly scant knowledge of, but thinking of things like shamans, sorcerers, as probably accurately in some sense and not accurately in other senses, but not wholly wrong, as wanting to harness for themselves simply all powers, to be able to destroy their enemy, to be able to get whatever they want at the how does Eliade say that they already, before the ritual drums are beating, flying away in the spirit world, right? Things are being knit in the unseen world. This is unlimited power as freedom. Hegel thinks is the primitive, original version of freedom, just as we can say by the time of the Athenian miracle, the notion of Dike or justice had taken its meaning out of the background of the collapse of the Mycenaean Wanex, where there was a solitary leader in a similar sense to the Egyptians, what the Egyptians had in pharaonic, long pharaonic periods, which are probably very variegated in ways we can't fully, don't have the sensibility to grasp. Maybe some specialists do. The general public is not aware of that, though, and I am not aware of it, but I just know that that lasted a very long time. And when it ended, there came a period of mafioso type rich families who invented the gods on their own, which Aristotle mentions. So this is the origin of the sense of the invention of the gods for the sake of the exploitation of the common folk. And then in comes Draco, Solon, and other lawgivers, and then in comes Socrates in the discussion of the Politeia. Out of this ground, we see one form of Hegelian development of the towards the begriff, towards the ultimate sowing of this raw concept of Freiheit or freedom as simple arbitrary power to get whatever you want spontaneously, not considering the principle behind that which you want in a way that breaks from the spontaneity and goes into a conceptual world and brings you into a conscious mythological framework. After that, and that's analogous to the development of the law in this empirical sense that I just enumerated in the sense of the Wanex or the Pharaoh, and then the consciously manipulated law, and then the consciously publicly promulgated law as meant to be rational, or what is the same in the service of the entire polis. So those are two examples where we could then say, if the same thing is happening today, then we have a contemporary situation according to Spengler. But I think the situation of a real break brings us out of the intelligibility of this kind of Spenglerian account of what remained of Hegel as the Hegel of the concept of the universal history and its dialectic. So in other words, Hegel posits a concept, or Begriff, which is supposed to come at the end, when we no longer need the light of concepts, and then just to guide us spontaneously in our actual dealings and in the actual government that has been established, or the regime type, politeia type. For example, the Tsarist Russia rather than Soviet Union. Those are the examples of regime changes. There's sometimes much slighter differences are given in American history as regime changes. But in any case, a regime change can't be understood as a change of administrations of the president, except, I suppose, except in the current situation where Trump does appear in some way to be, so at least not from 1776 until now, but now it does seem in a certain way that there is two regimes are being offered rather than two presidential administrations, to the extent that Trump would present himself as, by metaphor, King Saul, who the Israelites would then say against the wisdom of Solomon that we want a king over us. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And then they say, we want a leader to lead us into battle. Solomon says that's a bad idea because he's going to tax you and he's going to control you. He's going to be a tyrant. Don't do it. Nonetheless, the people say, we want somebody to lead us into battle. We want King Saul. So Solomon says, all right, I'll anoint King Saul your king. And in the same way, I see this is like Vivek Ramaswamy, and when he just met with Trump recently, this is exactly what his language was. We want a battle general. We want somebody to win for us. This is why we want Trump. So that's the technocratic reason for wanting Trump. Ramaswamy being a technocrat rather than a philosopher or thinker. And in that sense, yes, there's kind of two regimes that are then being offered. The old regime, the liberal regime, and some other regimes. So that leads me up to this contest between Zizek and Dugin, because it's a larger form of this contest over whether to stay with liberalism, as I'll try to represent and argue for in the case of Herschel Lauterpacht and his version of liberalism, which is called by the detractors of Lauterpacht, the Utopian apologetic swing, or the call for the end of sovereignty, of national sovereignty. So, or the other side is then, of course, in the direction, in the case of Trump, it would just be in the direction of national sovereignty and of America first, as they put it. But in the case of Dugin, it's Dugin has ruled that out. Said that's simply a version of liberalism. It's one path that liberalism can take. Because obviously here we still have the Constitution, we still have the freedom of speech, even though it's contested as to whether de facto those principles are active or not, but they're still the principles. And basically there's a commercial order is wanted, and arguably liberalism is the time after 1600 when the lands connect and the military forces were dwindling, when there was less and less. After the 30 years, during the 30 Years' War, you could still say there was a real meaning to the hereditary aristocracy as their entire adult lives, having for their profession killing people with two-handed swords made for slaughter and other such things. After that, it became more and more like there's a commercial order, and this becomes what we call liberalism. Then toleration, the principle of toleration comes in with respect to the religious wars, and people stop to believe in the heroic, and they begin to believe in the Max Weber version of the Stahlart-Gehausen, or the enlightened world where a steel casing of reason or engineer, Sam Harris type of world, Stephen Vicker type of world would come in and replace the world as it had been prior to that. So from within that horizon, we think of Dugin as thinking something outside of this, in the sense of his proposal of the reinitiation of the Middle Ages, or what he calls traditionalism as against liberalism, as a sort of a first step towards the what he's calling Russian civilization, Ruski Mir, or Russian world, and the Russian Empire as the reuniting of all the Eastern Slavs, the Eastern Slavic people, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And more than that, as power in this so-called geopolitical vision. So in this way, I wanted to represent the side of Dugin from the side of a sort of geopolitical mission, rather than the side of the so-called utopian apologetic version of Hersch Lauterpacht. And Dugin's side is then, that's represented by Georgy Arbatov, who was under Gorbachev. One of Gorbachev's guys said, we're going to do something terrible to you, we're going to deprive you of an enemy. So I said this exactly in order to say that what Dugin proposes is not the Schmittian vision. Because in Schmitt, as Leo Strauss shows, Schmitt is really still tied down to the logic of liberalism. Rather, Dugin proposes to return more to something that we could only think of poetically, in the sense of Winckelmann's saying of the Edel Einfacht und Stille Grosse, or the quiet heroism, or quiet nobility, and the grand simplicity, or noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. This is meant to say that what's really great is what is not, what is intense, in the sense of the saying of the General Giep of Vietnam, who says a gain in territory is at the same time a loss in the compact intensity of the troops, because you have to spread out to defend the more territory. Who actually won the Vietnamese War, I suppose, according to the strategy. But so then the idea is again, to return to the primitive unity that does not recognize the other Dasein, or the other cultures, as relative and merely different, but simply returns to its own vision. So let me give that a sense of why that would be appealing. So thinking of it from the version we get from Professor Sakwa, Richard Sakwa of University of Kent. What he says is, like 2 years after Stalin died in 1955, in the Geneva, we could already see the final meeting between the superpowers, um, where the other superpowers, Germany and Russia well, not Germany, but what Russia and England were still considered normatively and even de facto equals of America. But then after that, they became viewed as, he has a nice term for this, legacy great powers, which then he also says simply means subordinate. So they were assumed to, just like Germany and Japan, the other countries were assumed to then step up and take a subordinate role. France and Russia were expected to take a subordinate role to America. And since this didn't happen, we got on the one side it was assumed that it did happen, and so then everything the Russians said, like Putin's plaints for the last 20 years, were treated with laughter and not taken seriously. So that what happens when somebody's not taken seriously and isolated in that way, and they're what they say, they keep saying things and they keep being kind of laughed at by the Atlantic unipolar power. And then we got the current situation, and then we got, again, we're getting the same language to some extent. Okay, we could use a nuclear weapon here, which could possibly bring the world to an end, but this is again not being taken seriously because, of course, Russians aren't serious, according to the view of the Unipolar Atlantic Council and Robert Kagan and Victoria Nuland and company. So, or put another way, Ursula van der Leyen and Biden. Except it doesn't really make sense to put it that way because they're not theorists, but rather they're in a certain way they're undistinguished as far as their thinking goes. They're only distinguished as far as their power to make human beings do things goes. But so taken from that horizon, we can see where Dugin is coming from, and then we could see this at the same time as a view which is totally in the opposite direction of what I want to sketch just briefly as the side of Zizek as Hersch Lauderbeck's position. So Hersch Lauderbeck is how we've got the current language that we're hearing, and which has allowed for this trial in The Hague against Netanyahu and against Israel. The reason is because Lauderbeck brought in this possibility of charging crimes against humanity, and then the idea is that this is what's being denounced as the Utopian apologetic swing of Lauderbeck. So Lauderbeck was originally a Zionist, but he Zionism doesn't only make sense in the horizon of what's that case in France, the Dreyfus affair and all that. So even Netanyahu uses this argument still himself. Okay, because the French couldn't treat this guy Dreyfus fairly because there's racism in France, then therefore cosmopolitanism and liberalism have failed, therefore the Zionist project is justified. And this is actually how some of the early important Zionists, such as the writer of Entartung, or Degeneration, took it, Max Nordau. But in any case, that view shows one way of thinking about the edge of liberalism, and whether the gauge of whether liberalism is working or not working. How much are there things that are analogous to the Dreyfus affair, and how much, on the other hand, does the law treat people fairly within the nation? But Lauderbeck really wanted to expand this, and thus is saying that the state is merely an authoritarian convenience. And the reason that he says that is he wants to um, extend the extinguish the arbitrariness of state power as we're seeing. So, for instance, today with Netanyahu, and subordinated, regulated, with according to um, the the, uh, the Hague. So that's what we're seeing. So this court is giving us the language of Lauterbach. So we're seeing that today being argued as a ethnic cleansing charge. I'm not sure if that's the exact charge, but it has something to do with it. And there's long discussions are being made about the exact details of the current suffering in Gaza. So that's the Lauterbach side of it, and that's what he's trying to do, and the way of denouncing it. Lauterbach himself, and I think it's kind of squarely the way of denouncing the concrete position is of calling it the Utopian apologetics. So in other words, this is just the Hague has no power. It's like, with Andrew Jackson in America, where he's said, let the Supreme Court enforce their decision, but it could just ignore it because he was the executive with the military power. So but on the other hand, one can see that if the principle is respected, it has a certain power. And then, for one thing, Biden will probably Biden's in a great deal of clinch of pressure, where he's probably going to do something very brutal with lawfare as a result of it. Every case that can be taken will be taken. And so, by the way, if you look at the Richard Epstein and John Yoo recent video on the Supreme Court fast tracking this election the eligibility case for Trump to be on the ballot in certain states. That's very interesting on this lawfare issue. They mention a lot of the possible avenues of attack there, and also sort of it suggests the possibility for something far beyond the usual pallid cries of a constitutional crisis to break out. So we have that situation, and just in America, but we have in a larger picture the question of how will it affect Israel. All this criticism from the world will affect Israel and its actual martial doings. So again, it's the power of how to do things with words is coming into contact with JDAM bombs, quarter-ton bombs, and all kinds of such things, as is always happening. And this contest is on one side, and then on the other contest is a total break from this. And let me give another example to kind of show what the problem with that is and why it would be desirable to break from it. So, for instance, there's all kinds of contract killings in Russia. You could just look it up, and there's all kinds of journalists that are constantly contract killing. In other words, somebody opens the key to their apartment and a bomb goes off. That's a contract killing. So that's known in Russia to be ordered ultimately by the Kremlin. So if there were a pre-liberal state, that would mean at the minimum, what Dugin is saying, that there wouldn't have to be the pretense of freedom of the press. You could have just Stargrad TV, or you could have just whatever. There wouldn't have to be the pretense of freedom of information and freedom of the press, which leads to contract killings when people get out of line. So basically, this is under the Nazis. Remember what happened with businesses is any business that changed their prices so that it could lead to inflation, or who fired somebody so it could lead to unemployment, were considered enemies of the regime. So the Nazi regime was very short, but during that regime they were able to um, force the businesses to keep the economic policies they wanted out of fear. But Russians are so unruly, and the difference between Russians and Americans and Europeans, even though Russians are in a way Europeans, is that Russians are so existentially flitting about and free that even though they know that the result is death, they're still evading the tyrant, right? But even though they know the result is death, whereas in Nazi Germany, everybody obeyed that. They realized this: we're going against the regime, we're going to die, so they obeyed it. So this is a part of the breaking point where Dugin is just sweeping away more and more into Dasein and against everything that belongs to the liberal belief or the liberal concept that's still found in Hegel and the post-Hegelian breakdown into, Spengler was a degenerate form of both Hegel and Nietzsche in this sense. Although he's very good by comparison to most of what we get today is a very much higher quality, just as one must say Marx is a very much higher quality. But by comparison to Heidegger, who actually came after Spengler, is much weaker. So, we could see two very big directions. Let me say one more thing about that is that Lauterpacht came from Galicia. It's interesting that Agamben has written this little article, Galicia, which is partially in present-day Ukraine. I think much more than what Timothy Snyder, much more than what Timothy Snyder says about Ukraine is said in just a paragraph in Agamben's Quid Libet website or blog. And there's a little article there, with the title written down somewhere on that region, which is near, on that region, okay, here it is, sorry. The War in Galatia, April 24th, 2023, Agamben, Quid Libet blog. There he mentions, by the way, Joseph Roth was wrote something on the Wandering Jew, or and came from near Lemberg, or present-day Lviv, which is also where Lauterpacht went to school before he was, apparently he was refused the right to take these examinations because he was a Jew, and then he went to England, and ultimately, I think he went to the London School of Economics, and then ultimately ended up at Cambridge, and that's by that route he got all this power where he was able to spread his the current human rights language, which is now, as I just said, in control in this Hague trial and everywhere. And also, by the way, there's something by his later day colleague, Alan McFarlane, on the rise of human rights, I think it's called, or something like that, where he mentions Lauterpacht. So it's interesting that, that location is in Lemberg is the same. I'm not sure. It's also the same, by the way, as the writer of the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow, in the famous song from the 30s, in The Wizard of Oz, which, of course, the Warner Brothers were all Jews. And the guy that wrote that song was a Russian Jew from Lemberg, or near Lemberg, from Brody. And I think that song has something of this sort of memory of still when the pride as so there's something in the essay he writes about the pride of the bourgeoisie in their clean mattresses having replaced what does he say the sense of the respect for the pain and the heroism and the deprivation and dirtiness of those who live in forced to live in squalor or in bad conditions, as seen by the homogeneous bourgeois as they rose. So this Joseph Roth has written about in his Juden auf Wanderschaft, but I think it coincides with that song, and we can see then a totally different view, right, of history of that region of Galatia, Ukraine, etc., Malia Russia, etc. Then Malia Russia being a political concept, which is then a technical term of the geographers, which although it literally means Little Russia, as we're always told, it meant as a technical term the core of the Russians. So this is a political term with a political mission connected to it. There are no simple historical accounts of if we just list dates, we have nothing. There has to have some significance in this factor, and this is why history plays the same role for us as myths do for the pre-literate people. So on this kind of ground, rather than on the ground of Spengler, who stays within this brief and very tight logical structure, we have this opening up to this split between liberalism as what pulls us in and dominates us, and then this sort of distended nostrils of a being who is not yet human, like some kind of anthropos or by the biological metaphor of evolution, something not able to speak and therefore not yet human, with a sort of boundless anguish, but that it can only express through a loud growl or so. This marks a difference, I think, between, just by analogy, but just by metaphor, by transferring meaning into metaphor, the difference between Zizek staying with the liberal position and Dugin's going over into the passionary position of the total lack of concern with self-defense.